The secret that war attempted to bury always found a way to sprout, even through the tightly woven strands of barbed wire. Within the confines of the prisoner of war camps, where the cold precision of rules and the stern discipline of weaponry were meant to reign absolute, something far more perilous and unpredictable occasionally began to germinate. This forbidden connection usually started with a fleeting glance, a gesture so subtle it was barely detectable, or a simple, unexpected smile that managed to break through the rigid mask of the enemy. It was not love in the sense that they had known it in their pre-war lives, but rather a strange, prohibited attachment, capable of melting the thick ice of hatred and fear that defined their surroundings. This was a narrative focused on how the human heart, even when shackled by the bonds of captivity, consistently refused to obey official orders. It was a story of how the soul discovered methods for forging a connection, even when everything in their environment screamed of separation and hostility. The account centered on the women, who were primarily regarded as mere enemies, and the men, whose uniforms demanded absolute detachment and professional coldness, but whose eyes and actions spoke of something fundamentally different. They encountered not the anticipated cruelty and harshness of war, but a surprising, gentle kindness. This kindness, paradoxically, proved to be more terrifying than physical chains, for it forced both sides to remember in a moment of shocking clarity that they were still alive, and crucially, they were still human. This unspoken bond between captors and captured became a potent, persistent reminder that the deep human need for connection could withstand the most stringent attempts at suppression. The buses rumbled down the dusty track, a cloud of fine, ochre-colored earth billowing behind them. Inside, packed together in uncomfortable silence, sat an unusual cargo of captives, German women. They were not the grizzled infantrymen or defiant officers the guards were accustomed to. These were nurses, caught in the chaotic retreat across Italy and France, their once crisp white uniforms now torn and grimy, their faces pale with a profound weariness and the cold grip of fear. At the camp gates, the American sentries straightened, their rifles held firm, a collective anticipation rippling through their ranks as the vehicles slowed. It was an exceedingly rare sight to encounter female prisoners of war, rarer still to find them in military attire. The sprawling camp, constructed to accommodate thousands of men, seemed to subtly shift its very essence as the women descended, clutching their small satchels and thin blankets. The German nurses kept their gaze lowered, anticipating the usual barrage of sneers, insults, and perhaps even worse indignities. They had been indoctrinated with the stark reality that captivity signified dishonor, humiliation, and constant peril. Yet surprisingly, the guards merely motioned them forward. Their voices, though firm, lacked any harshness or overt hostility. The women moved through the registration process, a blur of names being recorded, and meager belongings being searched. Some of the American guards maintained a facade of practiced indifference, their eyes sweeping over the new arrivals with a detached professionalism. However, others could not help but steal furtive glances, their disciplined composure momentarily faltering as they registered the unexpected presence of young women amidst the grim uniformity of the prisoner population. The nurses, acutely aware of their surroundings, immediately sensed these lingering gazes. It was not the expected anger or triumph that filled the American eyes. Instead, there was something far more disquieting, a raw curiosity and, unmistakably, a nascent attraction. A fragment from one of their diaries, penned in those first disorienting hours, eloquently captured the bewildering shift in atmosphere. "I had anticipated cruelty," it read. "I expected to be treated as a criminal. Instead, I felt their eyes tracking me, not as a soldier, but as a woman. I was unsure whether to feel insulted or afraid." For the American soldiers, their spirits hardened by long years of incessant fighting. The sight of these German women, once the faceless enemy, now vulnerable captives, stirred deeply buried emotions. Their shoulders remained squared, their rifles poised, symbols of their duty and vigilance, but their hearts, unbeknownst to them, betrayed their strict discipline with prolonged, searching stares. Amongst themselves, the German women began to whisper, their voices hushed and uncertain. "They look at us strangely," one murmured. "Not like guards, but like men." A nervous, almost frightened titter of laughter followed, quickly suppressed by a wave of collective shame. This inaugural day indelibly set the tone for the unfolding days. The women had steeled themselves for the stark reality of barbed wire and uncompromising discipline. They had certainly not anticipated glances that carried an unexpected warmth, or soldiers who seemed caught between their roles as vigilant captors and men noticing women. The strangeness resided not in their orders, nor in the camp's physical structure, one nurse later reflected in her journal. It was in their faces. They looked at us as though the war had utterly failed to erase what we fundamentally were: women, not mere adversaries. This dawning realization was, in many ways, more dangerous than any rifle, for it planted a profound and unsettling question that neither side could easily dismiss. What becomes of the dynamic when soldiers and prisoners begin to perceive each other as something more complex than simply captor and captive? The initial shock of their arrival gradually receded, but an undercurrent of unease stubbornly lingered. Both sides instinctively sensed that something forbidden was already beginning to take root, subtly, irresistibly. The camp was governed by its stringent rules, its formidable fences, and its rigid discipline. Yet the expressive eyes of the soldiers betrayed sentiments that these regulations could never truly contain. And the German nurses, despite their lowered heads and outward composure, could not help but feel its pervasive presence too. The following morning, a crisp chill hung in the air as the German nurses formed their lines for rations, the methodical scrape of their boots on the gravel a stark reminder of their confinement. They braced themselves, expecting the usual barked orders, the jostling, the harsh verbal cues designed to reinforce their status as prisoners. Instead, a peculiar calm permeated the mess tent, an unexpected quietude that settled over the mundane ritual of food distribution. At the counter, an American soldier, his face impassive, extended a slice of bread to one of the nurses. As she reached forward, his hand brushed hers with an almost imperceptible lightness, a touch that lingered just a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. She recoiled instantly, a sharp, involuntary movement, her cheeks flushing with a sudden, unbidden warmth. Nearby, another soldier, burdened with a heavy pot of beans, observed one of the women struggling to steady her overflowing tray. Without a spoken word, he stepped forward, his hand briefly supporting the edge of her tray until she found her balance. He offered a slight nod as she looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and wary gratitude. The gesture, simple and unadorned, unsettled her far more profoundly than any overt hostility might have. A later entry in her clandestine diary reflected on the moment. "I had prepared myself for blows, for insults, for cruelty. But when he helped me carry the tray, my heart raced. It frightened me more than hatred ever could." These small, almost clandestine acts of unexpected consideration began to spread subtly through the camp. An extra blanket found folded with an unusual neatness on a bunk. A tin cup, brimming just a little higher with coffee than the standard measure, slid across the counter. A guard, pausing to haltingly translate a German word with a softer tone than his orders required, his voice devoid of its usual authority. The women, acutely attuned to every nuance of their environment, noticed each and every one of these deviations. Some instinctively turned away, their faces clouded with shame, refusing to acknowledge or accept the unsolicited kindness. Others accepted silently, their hands trembling as they clasped the proffered food or cup, fearful of admitting even to themselves the bewildering emotions these acts stirred within them. For the American soldiers, these small gestures were fraught with danger. Regulations explicitly demanded a strict distance, unwavering discipline, and an absolute emotional detachment from the prisoners. Yet the very presence of the nurses, Their vulnerability and unexpected femininity stirred something within them that they found increasingly difficult to suppress. An attraction, awkward, unspoken, yet undeniably potent, began to blossom. By night, within the confines of their barracks, the women would whisper amongst themselves, their voices low and urgent. "He gave me extra bread today," one confided. Another responded with a nervous, almost hysterical giggle. "Mine folded my blanket so carefully. Why would he do such a thing?" A stern, older nurse, her face etched with the weariness of experience, warned her companions grimly. "Do not be deceived. These are tricks. They wish to confuse and weaken us." Yet even she could not entirely mask the faint tremor in her voice when recounting the memory of a soldier's unexpected glance. A personal diary entry from that period captured the profound psychological contradiction. Kindness is harder to endure than cruelty. I could withstand their hatred, but when they smiled, I felt my defenses crumble. These initial gestures, seemingly trivial, a morsel of food, a simple blanket, a fleeting smile, carried an immense weight in the tense, silent atmosphere of the camp, far surpassing the impact of any weapon. Both sides, soldiers and prisoners alike, intuitively understood this unspoken significance. Something forbidden, something profoundly unsettling was quietly unfolding. It was not expressed through words or grand declarations, but through the minutiae of daily interactions. Through actions so small they spoke volumes louder than any command. And for the German nurses, the most profound shock of their captivity was not the barbed wire, the deprivation, or the rigid discipline itself, but the dawning, unsettling realization that their captors looked at them not merely as prisoners of war, but as women. The initial subtle gestures had irrevocably fractured the camp's oppressive silence, and it soon became evident they would breach something far more profound. As the days incrementally unfolded, the German nurses found themselves observing phenomena they could no longer dismiss as mere coincidence. The glances, which had initially been fleeting and discreet, gradually elongated, becoming bolder, more direct, and ultimately impossible to disregard. During the routine distribution of rations, a guard's eyes would invariably linger for a moment too long. In the stark formality of roll call, their voices, when addressing the women, would perceptibly soften, the sharp edge of command subtly replaced by a tone that suggested something more intimately human. One nurse, her voice barely a whisper, confided in her bunkmate, "They do not look at us as enemies anymore. They look at us as men look at women. That frightens me more than their rifles ever could." A poignant fragment from a hidden diary echoed this growing disquiet. "When I lifted my head, he smiled." The entry read, "It was not a mockery, nor was it cruel. It was a smile as if we were equals. I quickly lowered my eyes, yet I cannot erase it from my memory." Meanwhile, the American soldiers, many of them young and acutely far from the comforting familiarity of home, struggled visibly to conceal their burgeoning emotions. Some would stiffen their backs, attempting to mask their internal turmoil with an outward display of harsh, unyielding orders. Others, however, proved less adept at dissimulation, their grins slipping involuntarily when their eyes met those of the women across the stark mess hall line. At the communal laundry stations, as the nurses labored with heavy bundles of clothing, guards would occasionally step forward, offering an unsolicited hand of assistance. They would then pause, their eyes lingering on the women, as if silently searching for some unspoken connection, a mutual recognition. In the long, dark hours of the night, the women would whisper amongst themselves, torn precariously between a pervasive fear and a dangerous, burgeoning curiosity. One confessed softly, "His eyes followed me today. I felt a deep shame, yet a part of me was undeniably glad to be seen." Another, her tone sharp and cautionary, warned, "Do not be fooled. This is not kindness. It is a temptation, designed to weaken our resolve." Yet even she, in the solitary quiet of her own thoughts, recalled the distinct way a soldier's gaze had softened perceptibly when she had stumbled during a morning roll call. These increasingly pointed glances carried a weight far heavier than any spoken words. They served to reveal a truth that the rigorous military discipline had desperately attempted to suppress and conceal. An undeniable attraction had taken firm root, subtly yet powerfully, on both sides of the formidable barbed wire fence. For the German nurses, the profoundest shock they experienced was not born of overt cruelty or the harsh imposition of commands. It resided instead in the unmistakable truth they began to perceive within the soldiers' eyes. A nascent desire, which neither side dared to articulate aloud. A nurse with a tremor in her hand later confessed in the secret pages of her journal, "I was no longer invisible. I was not merely a prisoner." In his glance, I was suddenly reminded that I was still a woman, and that memory, in its raw intensity, utterly terrified me. By that point, the silent language of glances had become mutually understood by both sides. No words were explicitly spoken, yet the message conveyed through those lingering looks was unmistakably clear. War had fundamentally rendered them adversaries, but their eyes, in their raw expressiveness, betrayed a reality far more intricate and complex. It was inevitable that these silent gazes would soon give way to hushed whispers. As dusk descended upon the camp and the sparse lamps within the barracks dimmed to a soft glow, the confined spaces began to fill with the low murmur of voices. The German nurses lay restlessly on their wooden bunks, their eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness, their thoughts tumultuous and agitated. A single voice, tentative yet clear, finally punctured the heavy silence. "He smiled at me today." A ripple of nervous laughter followed, quickly stifled by the urgent shushing of others who feared discovery, wary that the ever-present guards might somehow overhear their forbidden conversations. The women then engaged in quiet, intense arguments amongst themselves. Some vehemently warned that the soldiers' attention was nothing more than a cunning trick, subtly designed to humiliate them, to strip away their remaining dignity and resolve. Others, however, admitted with a palpable sense of shame that the unexpected kindness reflected in those glances felt undeniably disarming, a disconcerting breach in their emotional defenses. A diary entry from that tumultuous period starkly revealed the internal conflict that raged within them. "My pride dictates that I should despise them. Yet my heart betrays me whenever their gaze softens with kindness. I no longer know which is more perilous, their rifles or their smiles." One particularly stern nurse, noticeably older and more hardened than her companions, reprimanded them sharply. "Do not permit yourselves to feel," she commanded, her voice firm. "We are prisoners, nothing more. To believe otherwise is to dishonor ourselves and our nation." Yet even her resolute words failed to erase the persistent memory of a soldier who had offered her water with a gentleness that defied expectation, a tenderness utterly devoid of scorn. She turned her face into a rough blanket, unwilling to acknowledge the unfamiliar warmth that still stubbornly lingered within her chest. Others, younger and more emotionally porous, whispered amongst themselves about their profound confusion. "They treat us according to orders, yes, but not with cruelty," one mused. "Sometimes I completely forget that we are even prisoners at all." The barracks, in effect, became divided into two distinct emotional camps: those who clung fiercely to their pride and ingrained suspicion, and those who felt a dangerous, unfamiliar curiosity beginning to stir within them. A woman, her voice trembling with the weight of her admission, confessed, "When he looked at me, I remembered how it felt before the war, when men looked at you without hatred. I wanted to weep." The whispered conversations circulated deep into the night, a complex mixture of fear, shame, and reluctant laughter blending in equal measure. None dared to utter the word love, yet all implicitly acknowledged a singular, undeniable truth. The Americans perceived them not solely as captives, but fundamentally as women. The profound shock of this realization disturbed them more deeply than any physical barrier of barbed wire or the threat of weapons ever could. By the time an uneasy silence once again descended, the women lay awake, caught in a relentless struggle between outright denial and a fragile, forbidden hope. A diary entry succinctly encapsulated the pervasive disquiet. We arrived expecting chains. Instead, we received glances. Tonight, I fear those glances more than the fences that imprison us. The murmurs that began in the barracks had initiated a process that none of them possessed the power to reverse or undo. Life within the confines of the camp settled into a monotonous, unyielding rhythm. Each day brought its predictable succession of roll calls, sparse rations, and demanding work details. Yet, for the German nurses, it was not the ceaseless routine that etched itself most deeply into their memories. Rather, it was the subtle, seemingly insignificant gestures, acts that carried a far profounder meaning than their modest scale suggested. During mealtimes, a soldier, his movements carefully understated, might quietly slip an extra slice of bread onto a waiting tray. Another would fill a tin cup just a fraction fuller with coffee, a barely perceptible generosity, before sliding it across the counter. No words were exchanged during these moments, yet the unspoken intention was clearly legible in their eyes. A diary entry poignantly captured one such instant. The bread was merely bread, yet it felt heavier than gold. For in his hand, I saw not the execution of duty, but a flicker of genuine care. I hated that I noticed it, that it affected me so deeply. Even the mundane act of distributing blankets acquired a new symbolic weight. While most were simply tossed onto rough piles, one guard, with an unexpected delicacy, meticulously folded a woolen cover and placed it with a gentle precision on a nurse's bunk. She froze, her gaze fixed on the item as if it were a forbidden treasure, something precious and illicit. The women, by then, had begun to whisper about these moments, sharing them amongst themselves like whispered confessions. "He gave me more coffee," one might murmur. "Mine adjusted my blanket with such care," another would add. The barracks would then fill with nervous, self-conscious laughter, quickly followed by a heavy shroud of shame. Yet, despite their conflicted emotions, none could genuinely deny having witnessed or experienced these small acts of unexpected humanity. The American soldiers, too, found it increasingly difficult to fully conceal the nascent attraction that simmered beneath their disciplined exteriors. Orders barked out in the harsh light of day often softened into a hesitant courtesy in more private, unguarded moments. Their glances continued to betray their true feelings, and their gestures now served to confirm what their strict military code forbade them from articulating. The nurses, in turn, felt the weight of each kindness far more intensely than any act of cruelty could have ever inflicted. Hatred was a straightforward emotion, easily recognized and readily rejected, but this unexpected, unearned kindness possessed an insidious quality, slipping past their carefully constructed psychological defenses. One woman quietly admitted to herself, a confession she dared not voice aloud. "I despised the war, and I despised the enemy. Yet, when he steadied my arm as I stumbled, I felt a warmth I could not deny. It frightened me more than captivity itself." For the guards, the internal struggle was equally palpable and real. They were soldiers, first and foremost, bound by solemn oaths of discipline and duty. However, each small, seemingly insignificant gesture, an extra ration, a softened tone of voice, served to unveil a deeper truth. Their attraction to the German women was steadily intensifying, inexorably growing despite the physical barriers of fences and the rigid enforcement of regulations. The women would carry these moments into the solitude of the night, replaying them endlessly in the quiet confines of their minds. They refrained from calling it love, not yet, but they possessed an intrinsic understanding that something dangerous, something profoundly transformative, was indeed taking root between captor and captive. These smallest of gestures had become heavy with unspoken meaning. A piece of bread was no longer merely sustenance. A blanket was no longer just a piece of cloth. They had transformed into potent tokens of something profoundly forbidden. And with each passing day, the precarious line separating duty from an burgeoning desire grew progressively thinner. The women had steeled themselves for cruelty. Instead, they found themselves ensnared by the unexpected weight of kindness, an invisible force far more challenging to resist than any physical chains. These small, significant gestures had, by then, begun to speak louder than any words, and it was only a matter of time before words themselves would inevitably follow. By this juncture, the suffocating silence that had long defined the interactions between the guards and their prisoners had subtly but profoundly transmuted. Orders continued to be issued with their customary authority, and the camp's stringent rules remained rigorously enforced. Yet within the interstitial spaces of these routine exchanges, an entirely new element had begun to linger. Smiles, fleeting and soft, yet too persistent to be truly concealed. The first instance occurred at the ration line. A soldier, in the act of handing a nurse her metal tray, allowed his lips to curve, for the briefest fraction of a second, into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was devoid of mockery, entirely lacking in cruelty. It was simply a human smile. She froze, her cheeks burning with an immediate, self-conscious flush, before she instinctively lowered her gaze. Later, at the communal laundry line, another soldier managed to catch a nurse's eye. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his subtle smirk betraying a sentiment he dared not utter aloud. She quickly averted her face, but her heart began to race wildly within her chest, filled with a tumultuous mix of fear and shame at her own involuntary reaction. A private diary entry from that period recorded the internal turmoil. I told myself it was nothing. A smile, nothing more. Yet in that smile, I felt seen, not as a prisoner, but as a woman. That memory clung to me stubbornly throughout the entire night. For the American soldiers, these nascent smiles were equally perilous. Their regulations demanded an unwavering discipline, a stoic detachment, but their hearts, unbeknownst to them, were betraying their training in ways their issued rifles could never hope to control. They would find themselves smiling inadvertently, unconsciously, only to then quickly straighten their postures, their expressions hardening, as if attempting to erase the moment from existence. Within the barracks, the women began to whisper amongst themselves, their voices low and conspiratorial. "Did you see?" one would murmur to another. "He smiled at you." Nervous giggles would follow, swiftly hushed into silence. Yet the very act of sharing these secrets carried a warmth that even their pervasive fear could not entirely suppress. These smiles rapidly evolved into a form of silent exchange, a nuanced language that both sides implicitly understood. No actual words were spoken, yet each subtle grin, each knowing nod, each lingering glance carried a weight far greater than any formal speech or declaration. Some women, overwhelmed by shame, resisted, deliberately turning their heads away. Others quietly admitted that these smiles had awakened something long buried within them. Faint, poignant reminders of dances, of carefree evenings, of lives lived before the all-consuming shadow of war had descended. One nurse, in the privacy of her diary, confessed the profound impact. "The war took everything from me. Yet, in his smile, I remembered that I was still alive, still a woman. It frightened me more deeply than hatred ever did." The camp still presented its formidable fences, its rigid rules, and its unyielding discipline. But these smiles, like defiant sparks, managed to slip through every barrier, every restriction. They served to unveil a truth that both sides had desperately attempted to deny, to suppress. The attraction that had once been a mere flicker of possibility had now grown undeniable. manifesting openly on their faces. These smiles, once innocent expressions of human connection, had become dangerous, unspoken confessions. Neither side could any longer completely conceal what had begun to blossom. The brutal reality of war had, for a time, silenced their hearts. But now, within the very confines of the barbed wire, these smiles brazenly betrayed what mere words could not. And it was clear that these smiles, in their own time, would inevitably transform into whispers. The first words escaped almost inadvertently, a fragile breach in the carefully maintained silence. It happened at the communal water line, where a soldier, engaged in the mundane task of filling canteens, glanced at one of the nurses and quietly uttered, in English, "Cold today." She froze, her body tensing, unsure of how to react or if a response was even permissible. Then, hesitantly, in halting German-accented English, she whispered back, "Yes, cold." Her cheeks immediately flushed crimson, and her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, as if she had just transgressed a law far more profound than any physical fence could contain. From that pivotal moment, words, simple and fragile, almost childlike in their innocence, began to pass quietly between captor and captive. "Good?" A soft inquiry murmured over a tray of food, met with a faint, almost imperceptible nod in reply. "Tired?" A question whispered near the laundry lines, to which a barely audible "yes" would be breathed in return. One nurse, acutely aware of the significance of these exchanges, meticulously recorded the moment in her diary. "I feared his words more than I feared his weapon. For in that single question I felt a kindness I could not resist. I answered, and in that answer, I betrayed my silence." For the American Guards, the inherent risk in these interactions was equally clear and present. Their superiors had issued stern warnings: no unnecessary contact, absolutely no familiarity with the prisoners. Yet their lips, seemingly against their own volition, betrayed them. Words, low and guarded, would escape their mouths when no officer was within earshot, tiny fissures appearing in the wall of imposed silence. The women, gathered in their barracks at night, would whisper about these forbidden exchanges. "He asked if I was tired," one recounted. Another responded with a nervous, almost giddy giggle. "He told me, good morning." Imagine, an enemy greeting me like a friend. Some of the older, more disciplined nurses sternly reprimanded the others, cautioning them that such moments were dangerous, inherently humiliating, and threatened the fragile order they had managed to maintain. But even those who voiced strong objections found themselves secretly cherishing these stolen words in their hearts, replaying them in the quiet solitude of their thoughts long after they had been spoken. A soldier, grappling with his own internal conflict, scrawled a note in a letter he never sent home. "I am not supposed to speak to them. Yet I find myself asking small things." When she answered, something stirred within me, something I thought the war had irrevocably killed. The camp's formidable fences still stood strong, a physical testament to their captivity, but language itself was now subtly slipping through the gaps, finding unseen pathways. Each word, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, carried a weight of meaning far beyond its mere syllables. It was an unspoken yet undeniable admission of an attraction that neither side dared to openly name. For the nurses, the greatest shock was not the gnawing hunger or the relentless drudgery of work, but the bewildering realization that their captors chose to speak to them with gentleness, when the ease and safety of silence would have been their simpler choice. One diary entry captured this profound truth with elegant simplicity. "Bread fills the stomach. Water relieves thirst. But words touch the heart, and I fear my heart most of all." What had cautiously begun as forbidden glances had now, inexorably, transformed into forbidden whispers. And whispers once uttered could never truly be silenced again. The camp was no longer merely a place of harsh incarceration. It had, against every rule and expectation, become a place where hearts had at last begun to speak. By this point, the clandestine whispers had grown too frequent and pervasive to remain unnoticed. Within the confined spaces of the women's barracks, quiet conversations carried a steady stream of stories. Tales of soldiers' softened smiles, of tender, hushed words, and of extra rations inexplicably provided. Each new account was met with a nervous, breathless laughter, immediately followed by sharp, urgent warnings from the more cautious among them. One nurse, her voice a low hiss, admonished her peers, "You are fools. If the officers discover this, we will all face severe punishment." Yet another whispered back, her voice tinged with a raw vulnerability. "And yet, when he spoke to me, I felt alive again. Can I truly be so wrong for feeling this?" The burgeoning rumors spread like wildfire, effortlessly crossing the invisible boundaries from the prisoners' barracks to the guards' quarters. American soldiers began to tease one another, smirking knowingly when certain men lingered a moment too long at the gates or stood unusually close at the mess line. A corporal, wrestling with his own observations, confided in his journal, "Some of the boys simply cannot conceal their feelings. I observe the way they look at the nurses. They are risking their entire careers, perhaps even more, for a mere smile. I fear this will end very badly indeed." The camp officers, ever vigilant, soon began to take notice of the subtle but definite shift in atmosphere. Their commands grew noticeably sharper, their tones imbued with a newfound urgency. Guards were sternly admonished to uphold strict discipline, to maintain an unwavering distance from the female prisoners. Roll calls became more rigorous, and movements throughout the camp were monitored with an almost obsessive scrutiny. But no amount of command, no increased vigilance, could effectively erase what had already begun to take root. The lingering glances persisted, unspoken words still managed to slip out in quiet moments, and the rumors, far from abating, only continued to proliferate and intensify. Some of the nurses, deeply fearful of the impending shame and potential repercussions, chastised their companions fiercely. "Do not bring dishonor upon us," they implored. "We remain soldiers of Germany even now in this captivity." Yet, even these staunch voices could not deny the subtle tremor within their own hearts when they recalled a particular soldier's eyes. Others, less burdened by pride or more susceptible to the unfolding human drama, quietly, almost eagerly, embraced the whispers. They would repeat the stories at night, giggling softly behind their thin blankets. He gave her coffee, he folded her blanket, he risked a smile. For those brief, stolen moments, the brutal reality of war seemed to recede into a distant, hazy memory. Amongst the guards, the internal conflict deepened considerably. Some openly mocked their comrades, deriding them as soft or weak. Others, however, felt a pang of envy, secretly wishing they had been the fortunate ones to catch a nurse's fleeting glance, to receive a moment of that forbidden connection. A few, the most rigidly adherent to military protocol, sternly warned that the critical line separating soldier from man was already irrevocably blurring, perhaps even breaking. A diary from one of the German nurses vividly captured the escalating tension. "We fear punishment, we fear shame, and yet the whispers spread among us like a fever. We cannot silence them. Perhaps, deep down, we do not even wish to." Formal punishment, surprisingly, never materialized for these transgressions. Nevertheless, the very air within the camp grew heavy, thick with an unspoken suspicion and an palpable sense of anticipation. Guards walked with straighter, more self-conscious backs. Nurses, in response, lowered their eyes more quickly and frequently. But in the secret, guarded recesses of their minds, both sides harbored the same inescapable thought. The mutual attraction had, by then, become utterly impossible to conceal. The relentless churn of rumors had transformed what was once an unspoken private understanding into a glaring truth that everyone, whether they admitted it or not, implicitly knew. And within that undeniable truth lay a potent mixture of both danger and an intoxicating desire. The camp, once a bastion of stark, unfeeling silence, was now vibrantly alive with a multitude of secrets, whispers, and unacknowledged feelings that neither side could any longer fully contain. As late winter cast its long, cold shadow across the camp, the formidable fences, though battered, still stood resolute, and the intricate web of rules continued to bind all within their grasp. Yet deep within the heart of the prison, an undeniable shift had occurred, a profound metamorphosis in the very nature of their burgeoning connection. Affection no longer demanded the articulation of words. It had transcended the need for verbal expression. Instead, it was conveyed in a profound, resonant silence, in gestures so exquisitely subtle that they defied punishment, yet so powerfully charged that they were impossible to deny. At the mess line, a nurse reached for her tray, her fingers hesitantly extending. The soldier holding it with a calculated delicacy allowed his own fingers to brush hers, a deliberate act of choice, not accident. Their eyes met briefly for merely half a heartbeat before she instinctively lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning with an intensity that betrayed her inner turmoil. Elsewhere, another guard, during the routine distribution of blankets, paused at a particular bunk. He placed the woolen cover down with meticulous care, his hand smoothing the folds with a tenderness that seemed profoundly out of place in the harsh, unyielding environment of a prison camp. The nurse, witnessing this, turned away, but later that night, she clutched the wool tightly, fiercely, as if it held far more than mere physical warmth. A secret diary, confided in the darkness, acknowledged this profound change. There are no grand declarations, no fervent promises, only bread, only blankets, only glances. And yet within them, I sense something far more dangerous than hatred. I sense care. The American soldiers, too, found themselves in a constant internal struggle. They would often attempt to laugh off their own actions, concocting flimsy excuses. Their hands had merely slipped. Their glances had been entirely accidental. But their hearts, with their relentless and undeniable desires, consistently betrayed them in ways that their rigid military discipline proved utterly incapable of controlling. In their barracks, the women continued to whisper, endlessly replaying these precious stolen moments. "He touched my hand," one would confide. "Mine gave me more food," another might add. These were not the stuff of grandiose romantic gestures found in novels, but for women stripped of every vestige of freedom and dignity. These quiet acts carried the immense weight and emotional resonance of heartfelt love letters. One nurse, her voice hushed with a quiet realization, softly admitted, "It is not love. Not as we once knew it. It is something smaller, more fragile, perhaps. But in these moments, I remember that I am still human." Even the very act of silence itself had by then evolved into a potent form of intimacy. Soldiers standing guard near the barracks would sometimes exchange no words at all with the women inside. Only a shared look, a barely perceptible nod. Yet these minimal exchanges were more than sufficient to send the women's hearts racing in the suffocating darkness of their bunks. The gestures were fleeting, inherently forbidden, and yet utterly unforgettable. Each offered loaf of bread, each carefully folded blanket, each transient touch carried the accumulating weight of a secret that grew heavier and more profound with the passage of time. The nurses were acutely aware of the inherent danger. The soldiers were cognizant of the risks to their careers, to their very freedom. And yet, despite this clear understanding, neither side could bring themselves to cease these interactions. For the profound silence that now existed between them spoke more eloquently, more truthfully, than anything they could have ever dared to articulate aloud. One diary entry captured this sentiment with stark simplicity. In their silence, I heard everything. In their silence, I felt more than I had in years of war. The camp, fundamentally, remained a prison, a place of confinement and suffering. But within its cold, unyielding boundaries, a fragile, forbidden affection had carved out its own quiet, sacred space. It was delicate, inherently prescribed, yet undeniably real. And though no formal vows were ever spoken, no grand promises ever exchanged, both sides knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within their souls, a truth that had bloomed in that powerful shared silence, something that could never, ever be forgotten. That profound silence had, in itself, become its own confession, and within its unspoken depths, hearts had communicated with a clarity and intensity that words could never hope to match. The moment the war concluded, orders for repatriation were issued swiftly. The German nurses were to be processed, their identities verified, and their personal effects restored before their departure. A line of trucks had assembled near the gates, poised to transport them away from the confines of the camp for the final time. The women conducted the task of gathering their meager belongings in near silence. Some kept their gaze lowered, deliberately avoiding any eye contact with the American soldiers who had served as their guards. Others found the courage to look up, stealing a final lingering glance. The American soldiers stood in rigid formation, their demeanor marked by the severe discipline of their ranks. Yet, beneath their composed exteriors, deep emotional turmoil was concealed. For weeks, they had meticulously confined their growing feelings to subtle movements and quick, hidden looks. With the final moment of separation at hand, the luxury of time had vanished. As the convoy of trucks began its slow movement forward, a few of the American guards permitted themselves the slightest, almost imperceptible nods. Barely there smiles were instantly suppressed, vanishing the moment their supervising officers turned their heads. The nurses, seated on the hard wooden benches in the truck beds, carried these fleeting moments with them, cherishing them as private, symbolic farewells. For the American soldiers, the memories also endured. Some attempted to capture their thoughts in unsent letters home, detailing the surprisingly kind eyes they had observed among the prisoners. Others buried the thoughts deep within their minds, frightened by the implications of what those feelings represented. Later, historians would term this situation a paradox, a narrative of mutual attraction that blossomed where only mutual antagonism was expected. But for the men and women who lived through it, the experience was profoundly personal. It served as a stark, humanizing reminder that even amid the brutal environment of war, the human heart remained subject to no official command. The German nurses returned to their homeland, wounded by the war, yet they carried with them fragments of the unexpected. They kept the moments of tenderness offered by the very men they had been trained to despise. For them, the greatest shock of their captivity was not the confinement, the lack of food, or the shame of defeat. It was the startling realization that even their adversaries could regard them with warmth, basic humanity, and undeniable attraction. The war had concluded, but the memory, haunting and precious, remained vibrant. Behind the enclosures of the American camp, in the quiet of stolen glances and unexpressed gestures, a forbidden connection had taken root. Although they returned to their native country, these recollections became constant, intrusive reminders. That in the depth of their captivity, they had been perceived not merely as prisoners but as individuals, as women,